We welcome all our viewers to this conversation. Our guest today is Julia Freeland Fisher, who joins us from Boston, Massachusetts. She's Director of Education Research at the Clayton Christensen Institute there and the author of a new book, Who You Know. This is what it looks like. Who You Know is written by Julia Freeland Fisher, who works at the Clayton Christensen Institute. The foreword for this book comes from Professor Christensen himself. And he's the one who coined the term disruptive innovation back in the 1990s and has remained famous for it. So what he says there would make any of us pause for a moment. Many of us can count on our fingers the number of people who've pushed us over the finish line in various situations, especially in our careers. And imagine what might have been if we had met these people way back in our school years, maybe, on a more systematic basis. So Christensen makes the case that this next wave of disruptive innovation in schools has the potential to provide powerful relationships to students who are left behind because of the limits of their surroundings. It seems so intuitive. Julia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nikki. Great to be here.
All right. So you've been working on this for about 10 years now. Tell us how your framework of the networked school can be replicated and taken out of the confines of, say, a rich world demographic, because a lot of your book is set within America.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, thanks again for having me. And just to take a step back, so the Clayton Christensen Institute, where I work, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank, and we really look at all the ways in which Clayton Christensen's innovation theories could change how we look at the public sector. And in our education practice, that has a lot to do with really rethinking learning environments from the ground up. We've been around for 10 years. I joined the Institute over 5 years ago. And when I first joined, we were really interested in technology for learning, right? So online learning and the power of online learning to disrupt traditional modes of teaching. But when I joined, I had this lurking suspicion that we weren't talking about the full potential of education technology, because just like we're doing right now, we now are in possession of technologies that allow us to connect across the world at the press of a button. But if you look at traditional EdTech markets, you typically see sort of just content delivery and assessment tools rather than connection tools. And so I really wanted to think about, okay, how could we use technology to disrupt the limitations, not just of what students know, but whom they know, the sorts of mentors and experts that are within reach. And I think we often say at the Institute, the greatest disruptions may come about in the developing world where access is sort of a chronic issue, a chronic struggle, where affordability is a chronic struggle. And so I'm equally excited about how tools to connect students to mentors and experts could take root beyond America, even though admittedly the book takes a very America-centric lens on the current EdTech market here. So yes, huge potential, I think, to connect students all over the world.
Julia, every school, no matter which part of the world it lives in, implicitly has this network, because every student brings with her or himself a network, an inherited network. So what you're saying is that schools need to unleash this in a more intentional way.
Exactly, yeah. So I think there's a couple, let's step back for a second and talk about why networks matter, because that can be, like you said, very intuitive to those of us who are further along in our careers and may have benefited from mentors or people who provided us jobs or opened a door. But economists and sociologists and political scientists often use the term social capital to describe the fact that a network contains value, much in the way that financial capital has value and our human capital has value. And so when we think about our networks and we use this term, I'll credit my husband for coming up with the phrase, who I wrote the book with, we use the term inherited network to mean we all inherit a network, and that already contains value. It already contains assets. But oftentimes it's also inherently limited, right? So I sometimes joke I'm the daughter of a psychiatrist and a lawyer, which makes it like a modern miracle that I'm able to function in the real world. But that meant that I knew a lot of people working in particular professions, but no one who worked in the current profession that I'm in, right? And so you can see limitations all the way across the economic spectrum. However, we have real data that shows students growing up in low-income backgrounds or in more isolated geographies have real limitations to their network that could inhibit social mobility. So, taking all of that into account, what we wanted to ask was, could you design schools to more deliberately shore up students' access to both caring adults that help them get by and to adults who are networked into the knowledge economy to help them get ahead? And so we wanted to think about both of those structures, which I think right now happen by chance.
You use the term social capital. It's incredibly hard to measure. How do you even start? Where do schools start?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, I don't want to purport to have an answer to this question so much as to point out this is a conversation we need to start and continue to have. So that we don't fall into the trap that the standards-based movement in America and I think some other developing countries have fallen into, where we only measure what's easy to measure, right? I think that's actually a real risk, particularly in our education systems. So here's a couple thoughts I have on this. Some of the measures out there, and these have been used in sociology for decades, are essentially called name generator measures. So you ask an individual to generate a set of names of those people in his or her network, maybe in general, or maybe who could help him towards a particular end. So do you know a doctor? Do you know a lawyer? Those are ways to start to generate almost a map of the assets in an individual's life, in addition to help identify gaps that schools could start to tackle, right? So that's one sort of measurement technique out there. Other measurement techniques for those people working inside of schools that I think are really interesting and starting to emerge. There's a project out of Harvard called the Making Caring Common Project, and we cite this in the last chapter of the book as an example of a school that put up a roster of every student's name and had all the adults in the building put a sticker, so it's real low tech, right? Put a sticker next to the students' names with whom they felt they had a close relationship. And what that starts to reveal is that there are students in school buildings today who may not have a close relationship with a single adult in that building. And schools can from there start to say, okay, how do we ensure that this student's teachers or other adults are reaching out and forging a close connection with him? So those may sound really, really basic, but we're a little bit at ground zero with measurement here. So it's a great question, Nikki, but one that I think we have to keep kind of pushing on.
I'm going to take that sticker example forward. That's basically homophily, right? Now, recently you spoke to Mentor Collective, one of the tools, and the companies which make those tools. And the person you were speaking to raised an interesting point in answer. He said that the last thing we want to do is to exclusively connect all incoming first-gen low-income students with people exactly like them. That's not what you want to do.
Yeah, so you do use the term homophily, which we use in the book. So let's unpack that for a second and talk about how it can be, I think, a positive phenomenon and also carries some risks with it. So homophily is sort of, in layman's terms, the idea that birds of a feather flock together. Similarity breeds trust. And sociologists use that sort of phenomenon to explain why, if you look at some of the data on people's friendship networks, the networks that they're forming, they tend to look quite homogenous along certain dimensions, such as religion, race, education level, gender. Now, the other thing that's important to bear in mind there, because that can feel sort of fatalistic, that we're all going to sort of self-sort into these discrete tribes and not talk to one another. But the other powerful fact is that over time, the dimensions along which people appear to be self-sorting have shifted. So in America, education level appears to have become more salient, where gender has become less salient in terms of how people's friendship networks form. Now, I know this is wonky, but it's an important thing to keep in mind when we think about how are we designing schools, because I think there's a temptation to abandon similarity in service of connecting across lines of difference. And what we suggest instead is that, what if we manage to surface dimensions of similarity that might not be readily apparent? Whether that's a student has a similar interest to a mentor from a different background, a student lives in a similar geography, a student and a mentor or a student and expert engage in a shared experience that sort of surfaces a sense of similarity. And so I think all we wanted to point out was not to say this phenomenon is inherently bad, but to say, as we think about networking students, it can be tempting to either say, let's make sure you know people exactly like you, to your point, and that could cause a bit of an echo chamber and sort of segregation, but it could also be tempting to emphasize asymmetry or difference. And we warn against that because it could backfire and really inhibit the formation of trust, which is really the glue in any relationship.
Okay, what about the schools themselves, Julia? Now, you make the case that they need to go beyond what they think is their core competency, which is teaching you stuff. What's in it for the schools to go beyond what they already do? And they seem to be overwhelmed already.
Exactly. And this has come up as I've started to sort of talk about these ideas. I was sort of in a research hole for 3 years working on the book, and now I've come out and started to have more conversations. And I do think there's a very understandable initial reaction to say, we can't even necessarily get the human capital part of school right, and now you're going to add another thing to the to-do list. And what I say to that is twofold. One is that innovation theory suggests that if you integrate across your value chain in any business, right, this applies from disk drives to motor vehicles all the way to school, if you integrate across your value chain and you control more variables that contribute to performance, you can actually get breakthrough results. And by doing so in schools, by starting to think about who do our students know, who are the supportive adults, who are the experts, who are the tutors that we could sort of swat around them, you actually have the potential to get better academic results. And we highlight some programs in the book that do just that. But the other thing I sort of say to schools is, and I think this applies to schools in both the developing world and more developed economies, is that there's a lot of shortages and crises that we cite that a more networked school could address. One of the big ones being human capital shortages, right? So we often in the US look at shortages in particular subject areas. I mean, in India, the figures are in the hundreds of thousands in terms of teacher shortages, right? But the reality is the world is awash in human capital. We just have not designed schools to bring in other informal forms of human capital, like experts, right? Like mentors, like volunteers. And I think as soon as schools can sort of start to open their perspective to other sorts of relationships that could be brought to bear, the project of educating students actually may become easier, not more overwhelming. An example of that, even from India that we talk about in the book, right, is Sugata Mitra's work in terms of sort of increasing access to education for students who are not in formal schooling. And one of the innovations that his team pursued, which is called the Granny Cloud, right, bringing in supportive, caring adults over video chat. That is not in direct competition with teachers. That is supplementing a student's educational experience to help him or her sort of persist through his learning. And it's adding another adult to the equation. So I guess that's a very verbose way of saying, I totally understand this reaction that it feels like adding more to the plate, but I think it's actually increasing the assets at our disposal to educate all students.
Yeah, you talked about the Indian example. So Granny Cloud, take Granny Cloud or Nepris. These are just off the top of my head, two examples which come up even in your book. I volunteer on one of them, so I know how these work. Now, these are by definition volunteer opportunities, right? But then again, for a business model to work, you need an ROI.
Yeah.
How do you start calculating that?
Sure. So yeah, and I'll make a shameless plug. So as we started to look at particularly the technology market, the technologies that were expanding students' networks, we began cataloging them on a site called whoyouknow.org. So you can go there and see the tools we found thus far. It's by no means representative of the entire market, but you get a feel for what's out there. And what we started to do, it's not on the site so much, but in our own research, was look at what are the business models, to your point, Nikki, that are supporting these approaches, and how are they either making money if they're for-profit or sustaining themselves if they're nonprofit. And a couple cropped up. So there are these volunteer platforms. Typically, they are relying heavily on corporate social responsibility dollars. But there is an ROI nested in that business model because businesses are starting to come to the table because of pipeline issues, because of talent development issues. And so a model like Nepris is able to say, you want more students working in STEM, research shows we actually need to reach them as early as 3rd grade. So if you give to this platform, you're actually making a talent pipeline development play. There's also, though, platforms out there that are essentially using what you think of with Uber or Lyft platforms. They're essentially using almost a gig economy model. So one that we talk about in the book, Student Success Agency, pays college students to provide online mentorship to high school students or secondary students. And that model is a lower cost version that, again, is unlocking new human capital, but at a fraction of the cost of a traditional guidance counselor to provide students with on-demand supports. And so I think, I don't want to sort of essentialize that there's a single business model taking root. I think there's a couple different ones, and the ROI sort of follows suit. That said, one of the things we think about a lot at the Christensen Institute is business model innovation. And I think this is a field where we are still looking for more and more business model innovation so that these tools don't just end up having to become curriculum tools, which is what we saw 5 years ago when we started to look at the market. A lot of the tools were sort of mentoring tools that were morphing into curriculum tools because that's where the market in K-12 sort of is strongest.
So what you're essentially saying is that the performance defining component of this business, for companies to be able to skate to that profit-making formula, is still a work in progress, really.
Yeah, and I think, again, just to slice the market a little bit for those entrepreneurs who are watching, in higher education, because it's not a single payer market, because you're trying to retain each marginal student to make money, we're actually seeing institutions of higher ed step in and start to pay for relationships, because relationships are part of retaining students. So I think there's a clearer sort of business model emerging in that landscape. I think in K-12, it's still a little murkier. And profit margin is sometimes a funny word, because for a school district, profit margin can be increased student outcomes, right? Because that's actually what they're getting funded to produce. So yeah, long way of saying we could talk about this for hours and not have a tidy answer, but it's something to really keep an eye on.
Okay, so you talked about walled garden systems. Eventually we have to come to that, which filter outsiders. In that ideal situation that you described, where schools can actually just go into a marketplace and pick and choose stuff, security, privacy, all this will come in. How do you carefully filter, especially when you're buying off of a marketplace? What are the issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And what some of the tools that we profile in the book, one particular called ICouldBe.org, have really invested heavily in sort of how to think about the privacy and safety landscape. Because obviously, as soon as you start talking about networking students and sort of making schools more open and porous, safety concerns come about. So a couple things to keep in mind. One is sort of having a clear sense of how vendors themselves are getting volunteers or paid mentors, right? And most of them in the US context are abiding by I should say all of them, I don't know of any that aren't doing this, are abiding by existing sort of guest rules in traditional school districts by doing background checks and by doing filtering. Now, filtering is a whole other issue for those sort of tech geeks on this broadcast, which I am not totally a tech geek, but I'll do my best here. There are much more sophisticated tools currently to filter text and email than to filter videos. So in those applications, you mentioned Nepris, and also Granny Cloud, in those applications that are using video, we typically see one-to-many applications, meaning one adult speaking to a classroom of students as opposed to a one-on-one interaction, which could be deemed sort of less secure and is not necessarily being supervised by a teacher. For those that are doing one-on-one interactions, we either see much more robust background checks or opting to not use video chat because it's less secure than text, which can be filtered in real time on these proprietary platforms. So it's like, I feel like this is my refrain throughout this, but it's definitely still an R&D phase because of where filtering technology is. I also want to speak though to the other thing you alluded to here around sort of a walled garden model. And although I'm emphasizing a lot in this talk the potential of online connections, there's a really exciting other sort of growing market of platforms in education that are allowing educators to go online to then facilitate offline connections in students' lives, meaning to source guest speakers into their classrooms or to source out-of-school learning opportunities for their students. In those cases, we're seeing the most robust background checks for obvious reasons because these interactions are happening face-to-face.
Yeah, and in other businesses like Uber and Lyft too, we've seen the best value come out of O2O networks, where offline online tools bring offline rewards. So I guess that's what you're alluding to, right?
Yeah, and I think this has to be one of Clay Christensen's sort of axioms around innovation is that it's always circumstance contingent, and I think we really have to keep that in mind when we're talking about access to networks, because if you're growing up in an urban center where the barriers to connecting are perhaps logistical, but they're not actually geographic, right? So there may be all sorts of opportunities around a school building that it's just not tapping into right now, but they're right there. However, if you're growing up in a rural area with sort of less access to, let's say, people working in the knowledge economy, then connecting online has a real competitive advantage, not to mention a cost advantage, right? And so I like to be circumstance sensitive there because I think it really does depend on, is the region where you are sort of awash in social capital and new opportunities that you could tap into face-to-face, or is it actually going to make more sense to go online to forge some of these new connections? And I think it's a healthy mix, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, so basically you're talking about the jobs theory then, where the jobs to be done are not always said in the language that is clear and in your face. You just have to figure out what's local, what the problem really is, and then plug into that. Okay, so you talked about California Summit, very impressive work that's going on there. What has that place done right? The fact that it exists, the fact that students are coming out of there means that somebody has made this work, and it's working for the students too, and for the other side, for the supply side too. What would it take to scale this to a larger population?
Sure. So Summit Public Schools has gotten a lot of attention here in America for a number of years, in part because of the sort of really innovative designs they've pursued, in part because the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, Mark Zuckerberg's sort of philanthropic arm, has invested heavily in the platform that forms the backbone of that learning environment. And the reason why we point to it in the book, I wouldn't say that they are the most networked model of school ever, but what they've done that I think others can learn from is that they've created a backbone of online learning that unlocks both competency-based progressions, meaning students are moving at a flexible pace through their learning, not sort of being rushed through lesson plans. And what that has done in turn is opened up new slots, we call them, new pathways through which students can learn while also building new connections. And that sort of trio of a blended learning environment that is competency-based and that therefore opens up to the outside world, I think is really where the future of school could head if we start to prize access to relationships. And I think that's really something to keep in mind. It's not that they have abandoned a rigorous curriculum in service of sending students out into the real world. It's that they're doing both at the same time. And by using time flexibly, they're actually able to use space and geography flexibly as well. So I point people to that example. We also mentioned a network of schools that's international called Big Picture Learning, whereby students are learning 3 days a week in internships out in the real world. And that's getting a lot of attention as people think about better workforce aligned learning experiences at the high school level. So I think these are all models to keep in mind, but part of it is how are you building a learning model that is both rigorous, but also more open?
Okay. For the policymakers, all this is, we're talking about schools and the customers, which are the school kids. But what about policy? Where do they come in? What do they need to do to actually make this happen? And
Yeah. So I think and this has almost evolved since we published the book. So this is all sort of work in progress. I think there's two main lessons that I would point policymakers to, although the list could go on. One is, if we think about the role that caring adults play in driving a student's success from a young age on and driving development, some of what education policy, I think, has missed is that we've treated academic achievement as a purely academic issue. And we haven't necessarily, and this is, I'm speaking about the United States now, but I think it applies in other environments as well, we haven't funded poverty relief in tandem with academic access and success. So we have not actually addressed barriers to learning while trying to increase learning outcomes. And I think that's a huge lesson in the US on the heels of basically 20 years of high stakes accountability sort of regimes. And we're starting to see more schools integrate what's called wraparound services, integrate sort of the sorts of care that could lift barriers to learning and allow more students to then thrive academically. So that's one big policy lesson that I think the US certainly missed the boat on, and I think other countries can borrow from as well. The other, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so the other has more to do with sort of this idea of a diverse and broad network. How are students actually accessing networks beyond the one that they inherit, connections beyond those that they may already have in order to have more access to opportunity down the line? And in those cases, I think there's two sub-bullets of policies that would support that. One is we actually have to start measuring students' access to networks. We actually have to start thinking about, are those name generator metrics or other sort of existing measures in sociology applicable in young people's lives, and could we start to have almost a map of what are the opportunity relationships in your life? The other is really unlocking what we call seat time here in the US, unlocking students' ability to learn outside of the school building and get credit for that learning so that they are both accruing human capital, what they know, but also expanding whom they know beyond the classroom.
You talk about a second phase of disruption, a facilitated network where customers exchange with one another rather than adding value to a VAP. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so let's just delve right into wonky business theory here for a second. So a value-added process business model is essentially a lot of the services industry where you sell me a product that sort of you promise will add value, right? So I go to a car mechanic, I pay a fee, and you fix my car. A lot of school is designed this way, right? I pay a fee as a parent or as the government, and you say you will add X amount of value, 12 years of formal education to my kid's life. On the other hand, all of us are starting to see the power of a different business model called a facilitated network, where the business is not the one adding value. The business is sheerly brokering connections whereby value can be accrued. So eBay, Amazon has actually become a facilitated network because different suppliers can actually meet and sell to customers on that platform. Obviously, Uber and Lyft that we've talked about, right? And those business models make money by brokering connections. And so we think that for now, because of the way education markets operate, most businesses are still hanging out in that value-added process business model, but we anticipate the rise of more facilitated networks as those markets mature, and particularly as access to new connections become a real value proposition in the education system.
Julia, I'm done with my questions. If there's something I've left out or some thoughts you want to share, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. So I think one thing we sort of skipped over that for most people hearing particularly about technology-enabled connections, this can be a helpful frame, is that in sociology, sociologists often refer to strong ties versus weak ties. So strong ties are those in sort of your daily life with whom you have a high amount of care, trust, you look out for one another. And then you have weak ties. Nikki and I are basically a weak tie. We've met a couple times ahead of this broadcast, but we don't know each other well. And that can sound like a value judgment, but really both strong and weak ties offer value, because weak ties, much like this broadcast, open the door to new opportunities that you might otherwise not have. And that's where we think technology and online connections have a competitive advantage in young people's lives. So we're not saying technology is going to necessarily supplant the care that is part and parcel of healthy development, but we do think that these online mentoring and expert networks have the real potential to diversify your weak tie networks, which in turn open the door to new opportunities. So I just want to clarify that, because otherwise I think for obvious and very rational reasons, online connections can feel sort of shallow and impoverished compared to what we think of as healthy child development with a web of caring adults there face to face.
Julia, just one question based on what you said just now. It's right on top of my mind because of what you brought up. Weak ties and strong ties, yes, I get that. That's fairly simple to understand. So when you have methods like the internet itself, it's a platform. So when there are methods to bring weak ties into the classroom on a volunteer basis, what then is the...
what happens next?
No, so you can do that on a volunteer platform like Granny Cloud, for example. So then again, my question remains, where is the money? Where is the performance defining component for businesses to invest? Why schools should invest, I think you've made that case very strongly.
Yeah.
But for businesses to invest while the altruistic model exists fairly easily. And that's where Sugata got his big prize from, right?
Got dollars. Yeah, exactly. So I think you have to, this is where one of the things anyone sort of who studied education over the decades sees that how we define performance is sort of an ever-shifting ruler, right? Right now, the value proposition of many tools is around traditional measures of performance, be that relevance, right? So a student becomes more engaged, and we're willing to pay for engagement because it leads to better academic outcomes. So just like we would pay for a curriculum tool, we're going to pay for engagement. Attendance, right? Are students, by having access to more caring adults, are they more likely to attend? And attendance is considered a sort of performance defining metric because we fund on the basis of attendance. I think that those types of metrics for now are what's driving business models. I hope that over time we start to see schools willing to pay for relationships, which would unlock this market in whole new ways. But for now, there are these sort of indirect proxies for the existing measures that the market cares about, that you see sort of entrepreneurs coming in. I think there's also, if you look at sort of the rise of low-cost tutoring and mentoring models, there's also a potential for direct-to-consumer plays to start to make headway, right? So parents paying directly for students access not to a sort of full-time babysitter or something like that, but to sort of instances of care, inspiration, and mentorship. And I'd be excited to see, I just talked to someone last week who's sort of building a platform exactly like that, hinging a little bit on the role that mentorship can play in the college application process here in the United States, given how kind of crazy and competitive that's become. But I would keep an eye out internationally on those direct-to-consumer roles, businesses that may be unlocking new connections online. So I appreciate the push on this because I do think that is the chicken and egg of any new market is where is demand coming from and or how is supply meeting the old traditional metrics of demand.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, Nikki. Bye.
Bye.